Okay, welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining today's Sales Enablement Series webcast on how to accelerate your ramp to revenue. We're happy you could join us. My name is Amy and I'll be the producer for today's webinar. I'd like to set some expectations for today's conversation. Today's call will be divided into two segments. First 30 minutes, our panelists will share 5 best practices to accelerate your ramp to revenue, followed by an open 15 to 20 minute question and answer segment. All external lines will be muted during the call, so please submit your questions via the chat feature located at the bottom of your screen, or you can share your questions during the live Q&A session. I would like to welcome our panelists for today's webinar: Roderick Jefferson, Sales Effectiveness Architect; Tim Ohai, Sales Strategist; Ed Ross, Organizational Performance Coach; and Tamera Schmidt, Neuroscience Leadership Coach. At this time, I will transition the call to our moderator, Tamera Schmidt.
Thank you, Amy. You know, we all would agree that as sales leaders and enablement professionals, we're faced by the need to increase revenue and market share, and yet everything begins at onboarding as the first critical step. We love the idea that it's not them, it's you.
So is that the pitch over to me?
Yes, indeed.
There we go. All right. Well, this is Tim Ohai. And I'm going to lead us off with this idea of product versus problem. And it starts with me, this idea of what's the goal of onboarding. And I think we'd all agree it's to get people ramped up as quickly as possible, but ramped up to do what? And that's the tension, right? When we focus on product, we get people ramped up to talk about products. But when we focus on problems, we get people ramped up to talk about the problems and challenges that customers have, which is most relevant to the customers. And if there's no problem, there's no sales. So the salesperson needs to understand this right away. And unless you have a one-call closed business model, which means you have like the hottest innovation in the market, you're not going to need to talk about your products right away. Customers won't engage with that. What they will engage with is someone who genuinely understands the challenges they're trying to address. That will open an email, that will answer a voice message, or even respond to a LinkedIn intro.
Yeah, Tim, you know, I love where you're going with that. And, you know, it's challenging, I think. We all know that we want to start with the problems and focus on being problem-centric over product-centric, yet many organizations and many sellers, quite honestly, still struggle with that. We know what to do, we know it works, yet our passion for our products sometimes get in the way of us focusing exclusively on the customers and the problems that they have and how we can best help them, you know, and then talking about our products later. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Well, and so the question it goes into why. Is it because, you know, we're a tech company and our engineers are all about, you know, controlling the sales conversation because they invented it? Or is it because our leaders are anchored to the past and they're not clearly understanding? I mean, there's a whole bunch of different factors driving that, and we have to navigate that if we're going to change the onboarding experience.
Well, I think you nailed it there, Tim. And a part of it is the fact that this is the way it's always been done. When we start out, the first thing we learn is about the company, we learn about the culture. The next thing that's thrown at us is what? It's the products and the solutions. I'd love to change that narrative so we're not talking about those products right away, but really flipping it to the buyer's journey and understanding where our sales process, our products, our sales tools, even our sales methodology fits into the buyer's process and their journey, and how we can then introduce our pieces that drive value for them rather than trying to get the buyer to fit into what we sell.
100% agree. So how do you...
Yeah, and
Go ahead.
I just asked, how do you do that?
Oh, you know, I think that the critical piece here, Tim, is helping pull the team together that is positioning the content for the sales team when they go into the onboarding experience. When was the last time we talked with our product marketing team and said, let's make sure we line this up around the customer's buying experience. Let's identify what support and services needs to say and how we make this come alive. I think there's a lot of collaboration within the organization that has to occur to create that first experience when the sales rep's on board.
Totally agree.
Yeah, Tam, I love what you're saying, Tam, but I'll take it a step further. It even goes back to making sure that that's part of our strategy, right? I think, you know, what's simple gets done. If we can create visibility to it so that people realize that it's part of the process to pull in marketing, to pull in all the different lines of business that will impact this, and then have that discussion up front. I think oftentimes my former teams, we'd get stuck in reactive mode, right? We did that after something happened or a product didn't take off as fast as we wanted. We'd go kind of backwards. But now what I hear everyone saying is there's tremendous amount of benefit in creating that strategy up front. Again, focusing on the problems that are unique to our customers before we even start to introduce product.
And I would go one step further or double down on what you just said, Ed, and just say that, you know, you have to inject the problem into everything else. So when you teach a product, you are going to teach products. You just have to anchor it to how it solves a problem. When you teach prospecting, you're going to anchor it to how you confirm that a problem exists. Because like I said earlier, if there's no problem, there's no sale. And we got to get that confirmed as soon as possible. When you teach demos, anchor it to how you explore and address a problem, not how it just shows all the features and benefits of a product.
Yeah, great point, Tim. Great point.
Well, let's
go all the way back to the discovery and the qualification phase. I think that's where we can make the biggest change. And that is rather than trying to discover whether you can qual in or qual out, which is necessary, don't get me wrong. But it should always be focused on, again, what problems are we helping to solve? Yeah. And where do we fit into the buyer's journey? Because we all know that the buyers are far more savvy now. They're further along in the buying cycle before they reach out to or even include a salesperson. So if we go back to focusing on the problems we're helping to solve, understanding what their needs are, then helping to translate that into our tools and processes and programs, et cetera. But again, plugging it into where does it fit into that buyer's journey?
I couldn't agree more. And I think we could talk about this forever and a day, given our passion for it. So I'm going to just transition us on to Ed, and let's talk about the whole ball of wax.
Yeah, Tom, thanks for the transition. You know, as we were just saying, it's not just about one component. It's about our ability to blend in tools, content, behaviors. You know, it's important that we establish some balance between all the sides of enablement, which is customer-centric as well as product-focused. You know, that's the whole ball of wax that we're referring to here is how do you successfully blend content, tools, and behaviors to drive sales effectiveness and enablement in your organization? You know, that's where the rubber meets the road. And honestly, that's the point where teams often get stuck. They get stuck in trying to figure out, how do I blend in all of those elements? What have y'all seen in the past that's been very successful in terms of pulling in content, tools, and behaviors all in your overall strategy?
Well, I think it starts with the orchestration piece, and that is, and I'll just kind of umbrella all those pieces under resources, if you will. And then let's also add in the human element. It's about making sure that the orchestration and the collaboration is happening and that everyone knows their role along the entire, again, buyer's journey and sales cycle. But more than that, it's making sure that everyone is on the same page, that the content reflects the messaging, the positioning, the overall strategy, and then the tools are in place to support that. And then the behaviors piece is critical. I mean, some can call it culture, et cetera. But I think it's really making sure that everyone is speaking the same language. Again, with us as enablement being what I call the owners of dialects and languages, we make sure that those are all connected and everyone understands those, and we don't expect them all to speak sales. What we do is translate those pieces and make sure that there's a cohesive and a continuous flow of that content, utilizing the tools and making sure people know how to use the tools, I think is important. And then the behaviors piece all comes together.
I'm sorry, I was jumping in too early, but that continuous flow thing is the critical element. And the best practice I've ever seen in doing that is literally break the different conversations salespeople will have down to their most basic elements, and then slowly adding more complexity. So starting with something really basic, like greeting someone on a phone call, and use everything, teach everything that has to be used to make that a successful experience. So the technique, the technology, the messaging, and the customer insight, and just to how do you get a phone call started. Once people have that, you just layer on. So by the time they finish onboarding, they can open a call or open a sales conversation seamlessly and gradually add in more complexity. So they can handle a really basic sales call and work themselves up to dealing with objections, and work themselves up to negotiating a close, and work themselves up to all those different pieces that come in later. But rather than shoving it right at the front end, layer that in over time so that they can have that continuous flow build up in their mind.
But I think there's an element of again, it's back to that collaboration. You know, when I was running onboarding at VMware, we took the time to meet with the contributors that came into the room, and we helped them practice their way of presenting this information, how they brought the content and utilized the tools, and even practice with the sales force in the room. So we look cohesive. I love this graphic because it's all the different pieces that you have to bring together in order to have that entire conversation. And if you put things in the wrong order, or you leave an ingredient out, like practice to the presenters that are joining the sales reps in the room, you know, you're going to have a flat cake.
Yeah, and that's the key, is realizing it, but then executing on it. You know, and Tam, I love the analogy of baking here. You can have all the ingredients and you can still bake the cake. It doesn't mean that the cake's going to be satisfying to everyone. So, you know, as we think about pulling these ingredients together, we have to remember that there are different learning styles, and that should be part of our overall strategy, is knowing that learners learn in different ways. So our program should be structured in different ways, and we, as the leaders of sales enablement and effectiveness, should have an overall strategy around that in order to do that. Otherwise, we're not doing our part, and we're creating some gaps that then require bridges.
You know, Ed, if I paid you by segue, I would be in such great shape right now. You know, we are talking about different strokes for different folks. And, you know, when we were all coming together to talk about best practices and things that we love about being an enablement professional, about helping sales leaders be successful and get that top talent onboarded as quickly as possible, we had a lot of conversations about the need to identify that it's a multimedia experience, that we know adult learners only learn one thing, you know, if you give them 10. And so we've got to give them a variety of ways to approach the material, and also to consume it and to live it and to learn from it.
I think you nailed it. And I'll just put it out there as one of the more seasoned folks on the call. I remember there was a time where we would go and we would sit and watch, you know, voice over PowerPoint for a half hour. And that's how we learned, because that's what we knew. Well, clearly the world has changed, and the world is more mobile now, and it's more fragmented. And I will applaud the millennials at this point for actually pushing us to change the way that we enable and the way that we teach, because people are learning differently now. And I'm talking about, you know, the blog pieces, not just the white papers and the PowerPoints, but even podcasts and webinars and things of this sort. You're absolutely right. Everyone learns differently, and we must make that adjustment as enablement professionals to make sure that we're hitting each of those learning styles. But I think there's another piece to this. It's not just about the different learning styles. It's about the feedback loop that comes from those learning styles, and then the iteration and the changes and the updates and the upgrades that we continue to make along the cycle, so we don't get stuck in that this is the way we want it.
Totally.
Yeah, I love that, RJ. You're spot on. You know, think about our panelists. I know Tam alluded to this earlier. We all consume and process information differently. And our teams, as our organizations scale and in our client scale, our teams, they have that same problem. They have that same challenge, right? How do you create something that takes someone throughout the entire experience of onboarding and getting up to, you know, accelerating revenue? Do you give them real-time learning? Is it all based on instructor-led? Are there self-paced modules, e-learning, gamification? I mean, there's so many different elements. And each one of those elements, I believe, has a place and time in a program. The challenge then becomes, how do you identify them, and then how do you deploy them successfully?
Well, and I think the best practice I've seen there is where people have literally designed into the onboarding journey time to pick whatever works best, so that there's time each week during onboarding where, like, big chunks of time where if I need to go back through an e-learning thing because I am not getting demos, then I need to go back through it. That's me. But if I need to go sit with somebody in the call center or go along with somebody who's actually doing demos and learn from them and talk to them after they ran a great demo, then I need to have the freedom to go pick that, so that I can pick not only my style of learning, but I can target the topics that I'm needing to spend time on. And if I'm doing great, let me get out there and listen to people already on sales calls and just see what they're doing and see what that expands for me and gives me different context. So when I go back to the classroom or go back to the e-learning or whatever, I have that perspective that shows me why I'm learning what I'm learning next.
Well, I think it also gives us an enormous extra help. As I know several of you on the call are sales leaders, and you have struggled with onboarding while managing your teams, and then there's the performance reviews, la-di-la. And so, you know, if your onboarding has this blended learning format, you now have content that you can give to a sales rep that isn't, in fact, in that position. They're not doing well. You have the ability to coach a new hire and send them back to use other materials that are already created. And then, of course, the new information is always relevant for those that are in the room, but you can repurpose it for that QBR or some other event that you need to run as the sales leader.
You're right. And it's that continual iteration piece, Tam, that we were talking about earlier. And I love where we're going, because we're no longer just kind of, you know, doing it one time and then walking away from it. We're now continuing to do a few things. One, we're including that legacy information from our learners and getting their feedback. We're getting them the most important information that they're looking for. And then we're continuing to iterate and upgrade the information, the content that's going out. Love it.
Absolutely. And I think that the most important thing is something that Ed's going to talk about right now, which is the whole idea of practice.
Yeah, you know, and as you create this framework or roadmap for your team, it's great to stand behind that and talk about how people learn. And it's the whole ball of wax, and we have to be problem-centric more so than product-centric. But then comes the real work, which is the execution. And, you know, I love this title of the slide, you know, practice makes perfect-ish. We all know that even providing them with those tools and resources, there are going to be some moments where people don't get such a clean start. And coaching is the way that we help them overcome some of the challenges that they might face. You know, we know that coaching is about building up our teammates, not tearing them down. And coaching has earned itself a negative connotation, but coaching should be built in from the moment we hire someone and they accept that offer all the way through promotion and succession planning. And it's a journey, you know, because coaching is just the first step.
I don't know where I saw the research, but I consistently see stuff like it all the time, which says, you know, coaching is the #1 easiest, most immediate way to increase your sales results. And it just
Absolutely
makes sense to lock that into the onboarding journey. If you want to ramp up onboarding, if you want to accelerate how quickly people can get to productivity coming out of onboarding and getting into their first close and all, embed coaching and mentoring. Peer mentoring is huge. It's undertapped. You know, there's a big debate around, you know, do I take my best sellers and pull them away from selling and put them in with somebody else in the team? And that's, to me, that's the answer, because it is a team. You can have your stars. The last NBA finals showed the best player against the best team, and I'll take the best team all day long.
Well, we all have,
Tim.
We have a business.
Go ahead, Tam.
Right? So, you know, the research tells us that the #1 request from the field organization is for more coaching. And yet the sales leader is leading their team, they're onboarding, they have a number of strategic commitments that they have made to the organization. And so when to coach and how to coach and who mentors is a powerful part of the plan for the company itself. I agree, Tim, using the A players to mentor and develop a new hire. There's also value in creating a peer mentorship right there in your onboarding room. When you go through a journey together, peer to peer, you help one another identify, I didn't know that, or, oh my gosh, my experience is as similar as someone else's. And when I think about back in my own career, my peer mentors remain some of the greatest assets in my personal network.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
I look over the course of my career, and when this coaching word comes up, and it comes up a lot, I believe that people want to help, and especially sales leaders, but I think two things come up. One, they're not really sure what coaching is or how to do it. And secondly, there's really never been an opportunity for them to be coached, so they're not sure how to pass on that knowledge. And I think that's where the peer piece certainly comes into play. But what do we do with those sales leaders, i.e. the first line managers that, one, have never been coached how to coach and aren't really sure what coaching is?
Yeah, Roderick, and this is one of my favorite topics, as you all know. First we need to define coaching. Some of the disparity that we see is that coaches have a different definition of what coaching looks like and sounds like versus the sales representative or the people receiving coaching. So we need to standardize a definition within our culture, our business culture and organization around what is coaching. Then, this is where you put your money on the table. We have to actually invest in helping those rock star sellers that we've just promoted into a coaching or leadership role. We have to give them some of the skills that they'll need to be successful as a coach. Just because they were highly high performing salespeople does not mean that they're going to make the easy transition into be a high performing coach. And they definitely will not do that without training. So as organizations, we have to build a strategy around doing that. These coaches, there's so much demand on their time. They still have that love for sales and they love to get out there and be customer facing. But how do we get them to the point where they can amplify their results by focusing on their team? And that's the challenge that many organizations still face. And it starts with, number one, coming up with some standard definitions of coaching. Number two, allotting time for them to coach. And then three, investing in them, giving them the skills, the tools, the resources that they need to be successful.
It's amazing how many onboarding designs exist right now that don't have any clarity or any true enabling of the expectation that managers are supposed to be coaching people through that experience. They just say, hey, we'll just schedule time and we'll put them into it. And then we hope the onboarding benefits from making managers available without any of the things you just said.
Yeah, Tim, usually it starts with a hug and a high five, right?
Totally.
We give them a hug at the end of training. We give them a high five as they walk out the door. And we're like, see you in a month, right? And that month becomes the toughest part of their onboarding journey without coaching and mentoring.
Or they had great coaching and onboarding, then they get to their frontline manager and the experience just falls flat. And they're like, holy crap, what have I gotten myself into?
Absolutely. And, that really brings us to how to pull together the whole storyline here. RJ?
Oh, this is my favorite part. I love the one and never done piece, because I've seen so many programs where we take them through this incredible onboarding series and we get them all hyped up and they're excited about the company, and then nothing happens from there. There's just so much momentum as well as selling opportunity and cultural experience that gets lost in just leaving them there. So I want to talk a little bit about some best practices that I've used and I've seen that have worked well beyond just the onboarding piece. And my philosophy has always been that enablement is an ongoing occurrence. It's not a single event. So how do we make that ongoing occurrence and take what was that cool experience on the onboarding piece and then continue to scale that? And I think there are 6 pieces to it. And first is a content management system, making sure that you have a single location to create more selling time for your sellers so they're not searching for a bunch of information all over the place. And I'm talking about your white papers, your docs, your decks, your battle cards, etc. single platform everyone can get to, make sure that they understand how to use it, what the value of the content is, and also the all-important piece that there's a refresh cycle in place for that content, because we all know content dies quickly, and there's nothing worse than a content graveyard that a lot of work is being put into that no one goes back to utilize. The second piece is a learning management system, and that LMS can be of your choice, and there are a lot of them out there, some better than others. I'll be honest about that. But the LMS is all about making sure that you have a single learner record and that you have reports that can be pulled. And this can be used as a coaching tool as well, because as a leader, you can pull the reports, and as you're having those weekly or bi-weekly meetings, as you're talking about MBOs and such, you can pull directly from there and say, hey, in order to move to the next level or to progress in your career, you need to sharpen your sword around XYZ skills. Well, we have those offerings either in soft skills or in workshops or great things that our enablement folks are doing in order to get to that level. Here are the things that I recommend you do. And then as you're having those conversations, reiterating and also reinforcing that. The next is having a centralized enablement calendar. There's nothing worse than not knowing what's happening. Look, none of us go to the movies without knowing what the plot is about, who's starring in the movie, and all importantly, how long that movie is, and if this is even the kind of genre that I want to go and spend my money and my time on. Let's take that same philosophy over to our users and put a calendar out. It does a couple of things. One, it makes sure everyone is aware of the roadmap that is ahead of them and where they are in that entire roadmap of their learning journey and their learning cycle. And second, it gives them an opportunity to parse out time and carve out time to make sure that they are getting that ongoing continuing education and that investment that we as enablement leaders and also as companies are investing in them. The next is reinforcement calls. And if I may, just for a moment, the reinforcement calls are critical because that's that continuing education piece around new product releases or changes in the political, not political, but in the competitive landscape. And then next is coaching tools, right? And that is going back to that practice that we talked about, and how do we continually have them, and I'll just say it out loud, trip and fall inside the walls of comfort, because we are far more forgiving internally than getting out in the real world and falling. And it also gives them an opportunity to be coached. And then finally is the mobile piece. And that is, things like podcasts and webinars, et cetera, because we're a mobile world. Let's go to where and the way the learners are learning. And I'd love to go deeper on any of those if you have questions or thoughts.
This is Tim. I want to jump right back to that whole roadmap idea. That's probably the most underutilized practice I see in sales enablement across the board, is that most people design onboarding to be the final step of the hiring process, not the beginning of a career path. And if you think about the different milestones that you rattle off, being able to handle your current role, but how do you handle a key account? How do you handle moving into management? All those different transitions that are part of your roadmap, most organizations have very poorly defined definition of what's required just to go from job to job. Then go within that job, you've got to be able to change your hat for different customer conversations. How I talk to an executive buyer is not how I talk to a frontline buyer. And I've got to be able to change my hat and address that. And most of the time, we leave it to trial and error. And we let salespeople figure it out on their own and hope they have a good manager who will teach that. But if we could actually engineer it, you will accelerate that performance.
Yeah. In order to ensure that we're not just allowing them to go out there and experiment with this, that's where it goes back to that feedback piece that we spoke about earlier, right? Feedback has to be real time. As we see these behaviors, if they don't align to the behaviors that we want within our organizational culture, then we have to be able to provide them feedback, either through coaching or through mentoring, as we discussed before. The job of today's seller is so difficult that we can't just allow them to go out there and, as Roderick said, trip and fall in front of their client where they lose credibility. We need to be able to provide them with an environment to do that internally. And I believe it starts with coaching, it progresses into mentoring, and ultimately that's the cycle of feedback.
And it's about practice, isn't it? And I love what RJ said. I have never run any kind of accreditation or certification program where the individuals in the room are more terrified to speak amongst their peers or strategic leaders than they are to practice in front of the customer. And yet, if we don't practice and make it a repeatable activity along with that feedback of what went well and what can we improve on, they do in fact take it out onto the street and say it. And that's an opportunity that we need to change and make sure that it's embedded throughout their selling career. And it, starts with something new, which is our onboarding experience, but it transcends that, doesn't it? And we want to make sure that they get lots of time to be uncomfortable in a safe environment and get the brand story down.
No, I'll say this. One of the best enablement experiences I had when I was a seller came from a simple statement. We had a sales leader that came in and, they do the usual kickoffs and ongoing calls. And the one thing that he said that sticks with me to this day is, we are going to give you permission to make mistakes this week. And the key is to learn from those mistakes and learn from them here in our family, if you will, so that when you do go out, it won't be the first time you hear that objection. It won't be the first time you've actually had to message in position. It won't be the first time that you've had to do discovery and qualification. And as that continued, I kept hearing that in my head over and over. And I think that is probably the best statement that any sales leader or enablement professional can use. And that is, we are going to give you permission to make mistakes, because most people are afraid of those. And if you level that out right away up front, I think that is a game changer.
That's huge. You're also teaching people how to recover, which in sales is critical. I have made some huge blunders in the moment and have had to recover to get the sales conversation back on track. And that's every veteran seller is going to tell you their horror stories of when they made mistakes, but hopefully they also have the stories of how they got back on track. And what you just said is critical to teaching that skill.
Yeah, and I think it's all about those stories. It's about shared experiences. It's the way organizations can leverage their most successful sellers and put them in the same room with this excited group of new hires to share experiences and understand what's happening on their side of the business. After all, if we don't use that as an opportunity, we're missing a chance to have our superstars, that A talent that we so want to retain, engage with these new hires and inspire them even further. And I think that's a big miss if we don't take advantage of that.
So the great discussion, panelists. I think we're now going to transition into the question and answer portion of the webinar. So we've got a few questions here that were submitted. I'm going to read the first one. How do you get your stakeholders engaged around making changes to your onboarding?
That is
Ooh, that's a good one.
absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. We have that, this great idea of what could and should be done here. And yet we need to go back to the stakeholders and we need to get them engaged.
Fixed problems. Several provision apps clients had issues with.
Hey, we've got a lot of background noise from somebody. It's a little extra confusion. So if you could, thank you. I'm going to throw in, here's what I do with my stakeholders when I have to get them engaged around this idea of changing and addressing onboarding. It always goes back to how much time and money you want to lose because people didn't ramp up quickly. And that turns into an easy conversation, but then we get into, so let's talk about onboarding. And we pull up these 5 points that we've talked about today, because those are the 5 points that we use with stakeholders to change the way they think. We talk about each of these 5 points, and we bring in the stories, the case studies, the best practices, the personal experiences. I've got a story in my pocket around how we helped accelerate a team at a large tech company go from 80% of target at 1 year to almost 160% of target at 1 year based on applying these principles. There's not a sales leader out there who doesn't want to get faster results. So you have to bring it back to the time and the money that they're wasting versus the time and the money they can get back if they change their approach.
Tim, you nailed it. It's not just the what, it's the why. And it's also having those stories in our back pocket to be able to share. I can talk about a marketing automation company where we helped trim time to first close from 88 to 54 days based upon the process and the interactivity of all the collaboration and all the things we've talked about. So it's about having those stories and being able to share, but not just from a story perspective, but really talking about the why, and then something that we all as enablement professionals have to get better at. And that is having solid metrics to be able to back those up and show the value of what we bring to the table and have that wrapped around metrics.
Yeah, it has to be about, the proof is in the pudding. It has to be both quantifiable and qualifiable. And we just had the same thing working with a team. We helped them find an additional $8.5 million in revenue in 1 quarter of coaching. So you have to be able to deliver an ROI story back to those leaders if you expect to have their support. Today, it's just, there's too many things pulling at their attention strings for you just to go in with a theory. You have to be able to go in and help them see what the ROI is going to be, in my opinion.
So do we have some good KPIs that each of us have used in our businesses when we've helped teams?
Yeah.
Absolutely. We're looking at time to first close. We're looking at product mix. We're looking at engagement rates. We're looking at attachment rates with alliances and partners. We're looking at activity rates further downstreams with the SDRs, BDRs, and MDRs. And all those things have to come into play and be able to be solidified. And the key is pulling those directly out of your CRM. So if you're a Salesforce shop, that's stuff that cannot be refuted. If you pull it from there, it's not, I feel like this is happening. This is hard, concrete evidence that we're seeing happening in the field.
And I would add, sometimes your CRM data is, there's skepticism around how good it is. So you're going to have to invent some metrics that your company may not be used to. And that gets into how do you actually define and measure the milestones that your people will go through in order to be able to do these sales results. So do they accredit, or in some companies certify at the ability to handle a product pitch? Do they accredit or certify around the ability to handle a key account? Those kind of metrics will give you something to anchor with if you can't get to those hard numbers, but you've got to get to those hard numbers. So if you don't have a relationship with sales operations, you need to go get one and get one now.
You're absolutely right, Tim.
Yeah.
It's not an or on metrics. It's an and. To be able to have those. Yeah. You're right. CRMs are a funny thing. We know garbage in is garbage out. So I love the fact that you added the stand and deliver pieces, the accreditations, the certifications, et cetera, that, again, can show directly. You can handle the company pitch, you can handle objections, et cetera, or you can't. There's no gray area there.
And I think it's,
Sorry, Ed. I'm just so excited about this topic. But it starts with the basic premise that which is measured is improved. And so you got to get a baseline and track it, each event or, over a year. And I've seen some really great inroads when the company goes and looks at how they're surveying their customer, i.e. net promoter scores and things like that, and use some of those to bring it right back in to the metrics for your onboarding experience.
Yeah, and Tam, in my opinion, those things have to be part of the selling process. When you look at developing a sales process, those all become landmines in the journey that we're able to tie back direct behavior to and a direct result to. So as we start thinking about sales process, we have to be able to look at those action items and tie those action items back to the customer's journey, right? Not focused on just what we're doing as sellers, but what is the customer doing to help us move this and advance this opportunity? I think if we can do those things that you heard mentioned here, that gives us a great starting on this.
We have another question. So how do you get sales managers to buy into coaching when they may not have had any themselves?
Yeah, it starts with, it has to start somewhere. You know, behavior is a byproduct of culture. Culture is a byproduct of your vision and strategy. So if they're not getting coached from the top, it's a hard road to start to say you need to start coaching. As leaders, we need to be modeling the behavior that we expect our managers to go out and execute. So it starts with the leaders of the organization. They have to start first. And when they start, it starts to become part of the culture. At least that's what I've seen in my experience. Team, what do you think?
I think that's one, but there's another piece. It may not even be ingrained inside of the culture, and that's where you come to folks like us on the outside consultants and get that different set of lenses. We don't have a horse in the race, and we're seeing this from a completely different angle. So I think it's a mix of the internal cultural piece of, you know, leading by example and demonstrating, but then there's just sometimes you need to go external and get a whole different mindset and set of lenses.
And, you know, Jessica just said she agrees with us, but she also believes that it starts with the sales manager. And Jessica, I couldn't agree with you more. But I think, again, we need to visit the fact that nobody has necessarily even taught them how to coach. You know, I was given the gift of developing the sales management curriculum for a Fortune 100 company. And many of them came to the table applying what they had modeled for them, back to what Ed brought up. And so giving them a chance to learn how to coach, when to coach, and what does good coaching look like is a requirement. And many onboarding programs have none of that when a person gets promoted to management. And in fact, we need to let them practice and give them the same kind of feedback that we would a new hire when they were working on the brand story.
It's hard to hold someone accountable to something they don't fully understand. So to your point, Tam, it's really about giving crystal clear expectations, but also empowering people to complete that. So I see a lot of companies will say, yep, we want our managers to coach, and then they don't give them time to coach. They suck them into fill in reports, attend these leadership meetings, do all this stuff. And the manager is sitting there going, okay, you told me I have to coach. You sent me to a 3-day offsite training on how to coach. Now I'm back in my job and you're not giving me any time to do it. So it has to be a true leadership initiative to provide formal and informal support for making it happen. It's like the old saying goes, the fish stinks from the head.
Okay, I think if we don't have any other questions through chat, we'd like to open it up to the audience, the live audience. If you guys have any questions, please speak up. Or if you do have questions, type it in our chat. I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions right now.
Hey guys, this is Jessica. Quick question. So for those of you guys who are running sales onboarding programs, which is what I'm doing at Upwork, how long is the duration of your programs, traditionally speaking? Just curious.
Jessica, this is RJ. I run a 0 to 60 day onboarding, and I'll say it's more like a 0 to 30 for your inside sellers, your VRs, MDRs, SDRs, but a 0 to 60. And we've gotten away from that 90 again because of the process, the program, the tools, et cetera, that we've been able to incorporate of trimming down that onboarding time. I stay in the 0 to 60 range. And then from there on, from day 61 forward, I consider them legacy sellers and part of the continuing education piece.
Yeah, and Jessica, this is Ed Ross. Our clients are typically running about a 90-day cycle for onboarding, and they usually move from their probationary period into their general status. So it's about a 90-day program, and certainly several different iterations in that 90 days.
And, you know, I would agree with the 30, 60, 90, although I've had challenges because 90 days is usually an actual quarter. So when you start, when you end, you know, perhaps changing it to a milestone at 45 days, because we know we lose everybody at the end of the quarter, and then it's hard to reconvene them at the beginning. So I think that, you know, varying it based on the cycles for the business itself helps slightly.
That's the point, right? That nailed it right there, Tam. The idea that it really depends on how complex your sales conversations are. So if you've got really, I'll say more basic or a simple sales motion to try to master, you can go shorter. But if you've got a lot of complexity, or you're expecting your sellers to be able to handle a lot more complexity over time, you're going to have to scale your length of onboarding to match that. But again, it goes back to what we talked about earlier. It doesn't all have to be classroom. So you can do a fully blended, ongoing journey that can start with a 30-day formal touch, but then it can go on up to 6 months to a year, depending on how you're defining onboarding and how complex you're trying to do. But you're not pulling people into a classroom. You're enabling their learning, but you're not necessarily taking them away from their work.
Okay, we have one more question in chat, and that question kind of relates to what you just said. What is the role or mix of virtual/web-based onboarding versus face-to-face, not including the post-onboarding coaching?
So traditionally, I have, and I also partner with HR, right? So there's a lot of confusion sometimes on the role between the sales enablement side and the HR side. So I would say that between the HR experience and then the lecture lab piece, it's about 5 to 6 days at the beginning of their time in the company. I also don't allow it sounds a little strong, but when running onboarding, the instructor-led piece doesn't happen until they have been with the company for 45 days. So say it's 1 day HR, 45 days in the role, and then 4 or 5 days lecture lab. And then there are quite a few additional pieces. And some of those are included in pre-work that they complete in the 45 days before they arrive, and then the blended learning experience afterwards. I do use the statistical data that the CEB produced some time ago, and this is for an enterprise sales rep. It's approximately 25 days out of field, their first 6 months in the company.
Tam, bring up an interesting thing, and Greg Little, what's up, man? I see your question around the difference between face-to-face versus virtual and web-based, and Tammy bring up a really important point. This instructor-led often becomes kind of the anchor, and I have literally worked with clients and seen other people do this, where they take the instructor almost out of it completely. It's all e-learning, but they go face-to-face with a peer, and they do job shadowing, and they work with somebody, and it just depends on the complexity of what you're doing. So if you're trying to put somebody and prepare them to be able to get in a car and drive to clients and see customers and prospect, they're going to need time out in the field, as you just said, Tam, but they're also going to need perhaps an instructor to walk them through. But if it's more phone-based, it's a lot simpler sales motion. You may not need an instructor at all. They're just going to need to be able to talk to peers and then have really good one-to-one meetings with their manager throughout the journey to just see how it's going. Let me look at what your work is doing. And the manager becomes, quote, the instructor, because it's designed to be that way.
And our roadmaps that we design for customers, Greg, it's typically about a 60-40 split. 60% face-to-face. However, that face-to-face is not all classroom or instructor-led time. We add in the elements that we shared earlier around mentoring, coaching, field rides, case studies, getting into client visits, and then 40% virtual, and that virtual includes all types of learning modalities. So I think it depends on the organizational culture, but we do know that because of those various learning styles that we talked about, right? Different strokes for different folks, that we have to be able to mix it up to keep the audience engaged.
Absolutely agree. And you nailed it. It really comes down to the company, and because I've seen it other ways and use it other ways as well, kind of chopping it into 3 pieces. The pre-work piece that Tim talked about earlier, and it's usually some form of onboarding, and also assessments and an accreditation. Some stand and deliver to show that you can exhibit what we're looking for going forward, because that piece I look at as kind of the what is, the culture, the solutions, etc. And then that's the baseline for the how-to. And I believe that the how-to piece, the instructor-led, the boot camp, whatever you may call it, should be a couple of things. One, it should be only things that you can get by coming and sitting a butt in that seat. Otherwise, let's keep them out and increase their selling time a different way from a different modality. And the second piece is that it should be focused on three things: key differentiation, competitive advantage, and business value. And I think if we stay in that box for that piece, it nails it. And then finally, the third piece is the deep dive, because we all know there are things that either A, don't necessarily fit into the instructor-led piece, or it's too early in the learning cycle, but it's a critical piece for their success. So it's really those kind of three pieces that I've utilized and I've seen work well.
Well, thank you, panelists. This was a great discussion. We are going to close today's call. Thank everybody for joining us. Please be on the lookout for a follow-up email. This session has been recorded. We will send out a link to the recording and the slides to everyone that registered and attended the call today. If you do have any additional questions, please just send those through via email and we will answer them. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you, panelists, again for a great discussion.